the state of Russia's defense industry 2 years after the war. That's what we're going to talk about today. It's an incredibly timely conversation, and it comes on the heels of a new report that we've released here at CSIS a couple months ago, looking at the state of Russia's defense industry, called Back in Stock. To discuss that report and discuss the state of Russia's defense industry, we have a fantastic panel. I'm joined, first off, by my colleague here at CSIS, Maria Snegovaya, and also our non-resident Sam Bendett. Maria is a senior fellow for Russia and Eurasia, and Sam is a senior associate non-resident fellow with our program, as well as an advisor with the Russia Studies program at the Center for Naval Analysis. We are also joined by Dara Massicot. Dara is a senior fellow at the Russia and Eurasia Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, our arch rival across the street. And we're thrilled that she was able to brave the heat and cross the street to join us today for this conversation. But Maria, maybe I'll start with you. Let's jump right in. We released a report a few months ago called Back in Stock. It came on the heels of a report that we did a year ago called Out of Stock. I think it sort of sums up the basic assessment that Russia has sort of found its feet and was able to ramp up its defense industrial production. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the report, and then Sam, I'll turn it to you as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It was an honor to write this report with my esteemed colleagues here, Max, Sam, as well as Tina Delbay and Nick Fenton, in which we come to sobering conclusion that, broadly speaking, Russia's adaptation to this war is proceeding more successfully than expected, and as you've pointed out, Max, hence the title, Back in Stock. And what are the origins of this success? We identified the key areas, elements, components that helped Russia to more successfully adjust. First of all, Russia continues to rely on these vast Soviet stockpiles, and the problem is that nobody really knows how much it has. But to the extent that it's traceable, one can say from the satellites, for example, that Russia is going through some of, say, its tank storages from the Soviet times. On the battlefield, we see that they upgrade them using more contemporary types of components like optics. And unfortunately, as long as they have those, they can keep going. In addition, there are other factors that facilitate this dynamic. First of all, overall failure of sanctions to radically undermine Russia's energy revenues. The economy of Russia is growing at actually last year 3.6%. It's actually projected to keep growing this year at 3.2% according to the IMF. And that's partly the result of Russia's ability to continuously accumulate vast energy revenues coming from the oil sales primarily, and then reinvested into the economy. Then, of course, there is the broader factor of the so-called global south, but particularly China. One of the contributions of our report is that we're tracking customs data to actually see that Russia really have substituted a lot of its former imports through China. And there's a very interesting part in which Putin's the influx of those components from CNC machines to semiconductors, all of them coming, like vast majority of those coming from China, actually tends to correlate with Putin-Xi meetings. So actually we now know why Putin is so actively traveling to China and what he's trying to achieve when he's going there. Mm-hmm. And last but not the least, all of those factors also contribute to general shift in the Russian accommodation to this war from more high-tech, sophisticated military production towards more like cheaper substitutes. We see that Russia actively relies on dual-use components, and that results in use of maybe worse-off quality, cheaper types of components, weapons. But unfortunately, as long as Russia has a lot of those, and Russia does have a lot of those for the reasons that I flagged before, it can continue fighting this war.
Yeah. Russia, it seems, has really been able to rely on its huge stockpiles of reserve equipment, modernizing that equipment with whatever parts and components it can get, and it's essentially good enough for the war at hand. Sam, maybe let me turn to you. You were a critical contributor to this report, and maybe you could talk a little bit about how Russia's defense industrial production over the last year, how that's impacted its battle plans in Ukraine. There's sort of the war that it had, or the army that it had, that it went to war with in 2022 in February. But now that's the army that it has now, and the defense industry that it has to match its military needs. And maybe you could talk a little bit about how Russia may have had to evolve there. And I should say that you're coming from sunny Florida, which is a little bit less hot than Washington D.C. right now. So over to you, Sam.
Great to be with all of you, and it was actually really interesting to work on this report, especially as we try to update our earlier assessments based on what we're seeing on the battlefield. Russia has several things going for it. Number one, as Maria has identified, massive stockpiles of weapons and systems, especially those dating from the Cold War that could be modernized and put in the field. Number two, and probably the most important element, is that Russia is capable of sustaining massive casualties without necessarily impacting the overall military performance. And of course, going from last year and into this year, switching from using private military companies and a lot of prisoners to now using a lot of contractors and enlisted military personnel. Russia has a large population, it has a lot of resources, and this is something that Ukraine has identified as a very important element in Russia's ability to hang in the fight, and this is something that we have also identified in the report. And so a mix of modern systems, a mix of older systems, and Russia's ability to learn partially, not fully, but partially, but enough to actually learn some of the worst mistakes from previous years and not to repeat them in combat over the past 6 to 9 months. That doesn't mean that Russia is achieving its stated goals. It's moving forward very, very slowly. It's wasting a lot of soldiers in the process. But again, it is capable of sustaining those casualties and moving forward. And its robust defense industry is now kicked into high gear with lots and lots of people involved in the process of upgrading, developing, and redesigning and fixing weapons and systems. And a lot of times this is done at existing enterprises, at enterprises that were expanded to accommodate this demand, with people working double and sometimes even triple shifts.
Let me follow up and ask you or Maria. It does seem that Russia is struggling to maybe produce the same the modern types of equipment that it was producing before the war. Has it been able to sort of build new, or is it largely refurbishing? Maybe you could talk about how it's able to kind of equip its forces. Is it what are the tactics that it's employing right now?
It's a mix of newer systems, some of the newer tanks and armored vehicles, new systems that Russia didn't have before 2022, such as Iranian-provided drones. A lot of commercial technologies that coming into battle and which are fielded by Russian forces on a regular basis, such as Chinese-made quadcopters or civilian-donated FPV-type drones and other UAVs in very large quantities. So it's a mix of some of these newer tech as well as some of the older and existing technologies. And this war, at this point, in mostly tactical engagements, which take place anywhere between 0 to 10 kilometers from the line of contact, you don't need very sophisticated systems with lots and lots of UAVs in the air. Movement and large-scale maneuvering is very dangerous, so you need to maneuver in small quantities of soldiers and equipment. You need to move very sparingly. And in that type of a scenario, an older tank, which is protected enough by cope cages and slat armor, is actually good enough. And this is what we're witnessing probably over the past year or so since the release of our earlier report. Good enough is actually good enough for Russia not just to hang in there, but try to take some Ukrainian territory, although at a very, very high cost.
Maria, before I bring in Dara, so China's been critical. That's what the report highlights. How has Russia been able to resupply supply its defense industrial complex? Is it all China, or are there other means? How is Russia able to sustain this? Given a year ago we were saying, while it's actually really struggling to find replacement parts and components?
Well, we can thank globalization for that. Much in the same way that Sam pointed out, Russia is adjusting militarily, economically too. Contemporary autocratic regimes, going beyond just Russia. Russia is not like the super innovator in that regard, are able to very masterfully use what globalization has to offer. And Russia, on top of everything else, has customs union with many of the post-Soviet states by its vast land border, which is extremely hard to monitor. So beyond just China, certainly we see a contribution of many other actors, even if the major technological, like the key components, elements like semiconductors, CNC machines, we see coming primarily from China and Hong Kong. Certainly there are other countries that contribute to this dynamic. Turkey still, although less so, and Turkey is very interestingly is rerouting now. Instead of sending straight to Russia, the products are going, the components are going elsewhere, to Central Asian states or states near in Russian borders, then going straight to Russia. But at least, there's an effort to somewhat comply with the Western sanctions. And the important difference is that China is actually quite careful, and many of these other countries operating, so to speak, in the white. They're very careful not to circumvent sanctions directly. So we're mostly looking at the dual-use components. But then we've got North Korea and Iran. And North Korea, as the recent news have demonstrated, probably will become an even more important factor in this dynamic. These countries directly violate the sanctions. They have nothing to lose. And hence we see precise ballistic missiles or shells going straight from North Korea, for example, to Russia. So it varies, and Russia is very proactively seeking new opportunities, going all over the world. We see that the Minister of Foreign Affairs and other high-level Russian officials are traveling all the time, trying to identify these elements, these countries which would be willing to sell to Russia, sometimes back to Russia, what Russia in the past could have sold to them. So there's a lot of creativity, and probably at some point this stream of opportunities will shrink because that's North Korea, for example, probably does not have as vast stockpiles, although nobody really knows for sure, but we can imagine there are limits to how much they have and how much they can produce. So far, though, Russia is more or less sustaining certainly its levels of its current dynamic in the war, even if, for example, in the end of the report, we identify certain weaknesses. For example, Russia is not self-sustainable when it comes to shelling, to how much it shoots per day. So in that regard, North Korea has been helpful, but how long it can continue, it's a big question. The key problem underlying all this dynamic is overall the failure, unfortunately, of the export controls to really radically undermine what Russia is getting. Having said that, while indeed the export controls are being circumvented left and right for this shell companies, we, for example, see in our report that majority of the companies that supply these types of components to Russia, they're fairly new. They've been created within the last year, which suggests those are actually shell companies created deliberately for this purpose. But to the extent, so this is the key problem that essentially we need to be targeting, and so far, the export controls has not been very successful. Having said that, an important area where, to an extent, the export controls have been able to impose additional costs on Russia is that indeed those components that Russia is importing are more expensive. Yeah. And we are citing some of the Russian military producers who are complaining about how they're supposed to be selling weapons to the Kremlin at the fixed price, but they're purchasing components and consistently rising prices. So it wouldn't be fair to say that sanctions don't work at all, but unfortunately we could do much, much better.
Right. It's sort of like sanctions. Maybe the way to think about it, it's not whether they work or not, but that they're providing sort of like a tax that is being put on Russia's supply chains, Russia's
transaction cost.
A transaction cost, and that's a cost worth putting in place. Dara, let me bring you in. I'm curious for your sort of general thoughts about the kind of state of the Russian defense industry and how you see Russia having kind of responded since the war began to ramping up its defense industrial production.
Well, thanks for having me, and I like your reports so much, and I hear people quoting tidbits.
That's why we brought you here.
I know. We're neighbors. Well, but I do hear people quoting from your report all the time, and so I think you've done a really excellent job outlining the problem with something as complex and intricate as this. And I find myself in agreement a lot for anyone who else has to write on the defense industrial base. I think you guys have really set the tone very, very high from the beginning. In terms of where they at and how I see this, I'm thinking a lot lately about reconstitution. And the definition of that is restoring a damaged unit or damaged military to a minimally sufficient level of combat capability. So when we look out and we see Russian forces using BMP-1s or MTLBs, which they've almost, I think, nearly raided all of the functional ones left, or just really, really old equipment. If it works...
Infantry fighting vehicles.
Yes, infantry fighting vehicles. If it works, it works. It's not going to work as well as a BMP-3 or a BMD-4, but they're using them. They have thousands of them out in Siberia, in the Far East, and it's really great for me to see other people out there in social media nerd out on all these facilities in the same way that I do. It's incredible the amount of tracking that's going on. So, hat tip to them. But I also think about this question, what's going on in the defense industrial base, and you guys highlight these themes in the sense of revealed preferences. Like they are maximizing what they have, triple shifts, bringing in prisoners, trying to fill these labor gaps as well as they can. And they're increasing it, but the space has plateaued, right? Mm-hmm. Like you can't create new space in this factory unless you take it offline, retool it with materials from China, but then you can't feed the war effort, or you take the part of your factories that are for exports and then you lose that market share, or the parts of your factory that are dedicated right now to repairing, not even new builds. So there's all these little structural things cooked in, mm-hmm. and why they cannot turn the crank, with the exception of Sam's area of expertise, which is drones and FPVs and everything like that, where they are making new investments into new factories. So we are seeing this very dramatic increase in those kind of capabilities. I also see a lot of labor challenges for them in the defense industrial base. And one of the things I think is an interesting data point is that Russia's defense industrial base is almost exclusively male. And that's because women are actually prohibited by Russian law and Soviet law before it from working in specific careers because it's considered harmful to their fertility. So things like working with ferrous metals means you can't be a welder, or working with certain kinds of petrochemicals means you can't do certain things that are related to jet fuel or anything like that. So I think about these choices that they're making and not making. And it's just like how they solve their manpower problem. We don't want to mobilize unless we absolutely have to, which we did once, but we would prefer to offer expensive social benefits and entitlements and money. And we'll recruit directly from violent felons. And that's fine because that's more stability. We like that. We'll go with that. We'll run that to the ground. And it's almost like they're making the same choices in the defense industrial base. They're not sinking money at this time into forcibly converting multiple civilian factories into defense firms. They're not fully moving the economy into a wartime setting. I mean, they're moving along. They're there partially, but they haven't compelled labor. They haven't changed those laws to bring in more women. Russian women, I guess they're okay. Sam would know that they're recruiting women from abroad to populate the drone factories. So I look at this in the context of the choices they're making on the battlefield, in the context they're making with their defense base, and it seems to me, at least for right now, that they're willing to press and crank to a certain point. And I think it'll be really important for all of us. We're watching closely what they decide to do with the next state armaments program, mm-hmm. which is when it was Shoigu, when he was the defense minister, they were talking about having this is a 10-year rearmament program, come out at the beginning of next year, and it will last until, I think, 2034. We'll see if that's still on track or whether the new team is going to make changes, but I think that new plan will be very revealing for what they do next.
No, it's really interesting comments, because I think we in the West are always sort of going on about how we haven't tooled up for a wartime economy, and with the presumption that Russia has, and I think in many respects it has, but you're pointing out that it's still facing these similar dilemmas of do you convert civilian industries? Do you change kind of socially how your society is structured, bringing women into these factories? And they're not making some of those crucial decisions, in part because oftentimes when, at least the way I see it, sometimes you engage in any war that a country engages in, they always hope it's short. In some ways, it's always hard to plan for something to be extended. Sam, I want to maybe ask for your thoughts on Dara's comments and how you kind of see some of the challenges, perhaps, to the Russian defense industrial ramp up.
I mostly agree with Dara, and I think she outlined a lot of very important trends which are facing the Russian defense sector right now. I would also like to add that Russian defense sector and the Russian government in general today are headed by relatively competent bureaucrats. And we have to factor that in when we talk about Russian defense sector and its performance in the war, because it's a lot of these competent bureaucrats that stand behind not just Russia's economic performance, but also its military performance and all the acquisition, procurement, and weapons development. Russia has a new defense minister. He comes from mostly civilian background. He does not have any specific connections to the military. He didn't actually serve. And so he's got a massive uphill battle to maintain Russia's pressure on Ukraine, as well as to continue acquiring and developing weapons. What's interesting is what actually happened after our report has come out, and that is Russian president has tasked this new defense minister, Belousov, with opening up the Ministry of Defense to rapid innovation, to scaling up innovation, and possible cooperation with non-military civilian efforts, which are so instrumental, for example, when it comes to the acquisition and fielding of UAVs in this war. And so it is important to consider how this new defense minister and his entourage are going to perform when it comes to maintaining the pace and getting weapons and systems out into the field, and perhaps trying to streamline some of the MOD practices for a much faster ability to get weapons and systems into the field. Again, it's an uphill battle. MOD is notoriously obtuse when it comes to how it does things. It is a massive bureaucracy. It's got a lot of corruption, and that too has to be factored into this equation. So it is really a mix. On one hand, there are competent people who are moving into positions of power. On the other hand, they have to deal with this absolutely massive machine, which is very slow to move and very slow to adapt. And so Dara was right to identify some of the problems which are facing the defense sector, especially when it comes to acquiring additional labor. And at the same time, we as analysts here have to consider that Russia doesn't necessarily have to do things at 100%. The fielding of older weapons and systems is basically an 80% solution, and that is good enough. And this is what Russia is experiencing right now. Its weapons and tactics are good enough to keep pressure on Ukraine and to maintain that pressure well into 2024 and beyond. And so this has to be considered as well.
Sam, let me maybe follow up on drones specifically, because this strikes me as one of the more challenging areas for perhaps a very, very bureaucratic defense industrial complex, because of how sort of dynamic the drone war has been in Ukraine and how it's constantly evolving. What lessons do you take from Russia's drone production? Is this all them sort of buying Iranian? Is it have they figured out ways to kind of crack the code on their own defense industrial production? Do they have real issues there when it comes to drones? And have they shown an ability to evolve and adapt?
So several things to consider. Number one, Russian military has been adept and quite adaptable in fielding mid-range to long-range UAVs, such as Iranian-provided Shaheds, which are flying under the Russian name of Gerain, such as its own Landsats and Kubs, and redevelopments of some of these systems into more capable and more numerous UAVs. But when it comes to tactical UAVs, Russian military and probably most militaries around the world were completely unprepared for the impact of tactical UAV systems, such as those that have to operate at a very short distance. And this is where civilian technology stepped in, almost at 100% capacity. Most of the FPVs supplied to the Russian military come from volunteer communities. Most of the quadcopters flown by Russian military with great success actually come from civilian efforts as well, and those are purchased from China directly. And so it's a mix for the Russian military when it comes to analyzing its performance. On one hand, relatively stable development and fielding of military-grade UAVs, especially those for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Yet on the other hand, reliance on some of the civilian efforts. And so, as I mentioned, newly appointed Defense Minister Belousov's task of opening up the Defense Ministry to innovation, this probably concerns some of the lessons learned already with using tactical UAV systems. All of those rely in a very large part on imported components. FPVs are assembled from Chinese components almost at 100% capacity. Russia claims that it is now substituting some of those components domestically, but it is far from achieving a full independence from China. And that, of course, goes for Ukraine as well. There's no substitute for a DJI drone. There's also no substitute for a quick and cheap assembly of FPV drones from readily available Chinese components. And so Russian government actually tasked its defense industrial complex to come up with solutions to rely less and less on China. But that's a long process, and it's a long-term process and a difficult process. And even in peacetime, in war, this becomes even more difficult. And this is where Russia's reliance on China comes at a most crucial time for its ability to continue pressing Ukrainian troops on the ground.
I want to go a little bit deeper into Russia's new defense minister, the shakeup of the defense ministry, as well as North Korea. But before going there, let me just maybe follow on with a couple of other systems that we're seeing employed in the war with seeming real impacts. And that's both the Russian use of glide bombs as well as missile strikes against, in particular, Ukraine's defense industry or energy infrastructure. I was in Ukraine in early April and met with folks from the Ukrainian Minister of Energy. And the challenges are incredibly significant. In fact, probably some of the foremost experts on the impacts of Russian missiles and drones are actually energy folks in Ukraine, who are then having to figure out how to rebuild their energy infrastructure, how to protect their energy infrastructure. But it does seem that the war has shifted from being, in some ways, a ground war to Russia having more impact, more effects with its air force. And I'm curious how much of that is tied to kind of defense industrial production. Dara, maybe I could start with you, and then we can go down the line.
Sure. I'll just speak about the operational impacts of some of these things, and talking about the glide bombs. They're getting longer range. As time goes on, they are a huge problem for Ukrainian forces, operating positions on the ground, command posts, cities, villages. They're all being impacted.
And glide bombs, to just clarify, are effectively older Russian munitions, essentially dumb bombs that then they attach a kit to it, a fan. It can then glide to its target in somewhat precise manner, but not as accurate as we would consider kind of some of our munitions.
That's right. And so the rate at which the Russians have used this has really gone up quite sharply in the last 9 months, I would say, in particular. It's a really big problem, because as far as I can tell, they are coming from bases that are very difficult for the Ukrainians to range, or they don't have the authority to use the weapons they do have to attack Russian airfields, with the exception of a few in Crimea. So this is an ongoing challenge, and it will become increasingly expensive and prohibitive to try to strike Russian aircraft while they're airborne to do this. It's much easier to get them while they're preparing the sortie, or they've just returned. So that's one issue. The energy grid is another. I think President Zelensky said a month ago that they're down to 50% capacity, and they're trying to fix this as quickly as possible before the winter. The Russians have been chipping away at this since September of 2022, and they continue to do it. It's pretty methodical. If you look at the strikes that just happened in the last few days, they're again targeting electricity. And you can't have factories that are populating and supplying power to your defense industrial base in Ukraine if you have no power. So there's many follow-on effects to this. If we're talking about the defense industry, there's follow-on effects to this in terms of the civilians who live in very populated areas like Kharkiv. But this is part of Russian strategy. This is cooked into the tin. It's make life so uncomfortable for civilians that it's just not really livable. They become refugees, and that pushes the chaos into Europe. At least that's the design. Or it puts pressure on the government to sue for peace. And that's where they're at right now. It's in the beginning, it wasn't very effective because Russia did not have the Shahed drones that are really supplementing these attacks on Ukrainian energy grid. Now they have both. And we have seen their strike patterns become more and more complicated as they're trying to adjust to the Ukrainian air defense systems, and they're countering. It's a cat and mouse game, and the cycles are getting fast and really tight right now. So we're seeing a lot of adaptation in real time.
Yeah, there's sort of an exhausting the population element to this, where every time Russian Air Force sort of takes off and it looks like it's going to do a strike, everyone in Ukraine gets an alert that says, take cover. And if that's happening continuously, it can be hard for people to get a good night's sleep. Maria, Sam, how much of this is contributing? Is this the Russian defense industry ramping up? Chinese parts and components, Western parts and components, allowing their kind of missile production to ramp up, where Russia can use these, expensive missiles for targeting energy infrastructure as opposed to, battlefield effects.
I'll just quickly jump in by giving the statistics, which is really terrifying, given by Zelensky, who said that about 80% of thermal power generation and a third of hydro power generation was destroyed in Ukraine by these Russian strikes. This announcement came in June. So that just gives the general picture. And obviously, my own friends in Ukraine, they just, every time we're on the call, they're sitting without light. Every time we talk. So that's just to demonstrate how bad the situation is. Even if I have to really commend Ukraine for adjustment, they do provide a lot of private generators that are able to at least temporarily substitute for it. And I'm sure some will be more qualified to comment, but in general, one, as has been pointed out, one of the key elements of Russian effective targets is the so-called emergence of the so-called Russian loitering munitions kill chains, essentially drone chains that are various types of drones, some of them commercial, actually imported directly from China. You can purchase them on China's, Amazon-like websites, which are then compiled into this chain of drones. Each of them have their own different purpose. One of them identifies targets and then conveys targeting data, and then yet another one actually targets that goal, which ended up being quite efficient, as it seems, for Russia. And for all the talk of the lack of Russian civil society, this is unfortunately where a volunteering effort on the Russian side ended up being quite successful in supplying those drones. According to Ukrainian data, the number of Russian volunteer-built FPV drones and light quadrocopters may total about 300,000 per month. That's all the volunteer effort on the ground, unfortunately.
Sam, over to you.
I would agree with Maria's assessment. One of the more interesting aspects of dealing with numbers is that both sides are sometimes using the same language when describing the other side's advantage in, for example, tactical drone use and tactical drone numbers. I think what's come to light after we released our report, and we do rely on Ukrainian numbers and Ukrainian assessments, is that even if the Russian civilian society is capable of manufacturing a staggering number of drones, only a small fraction of them are actually going to be used in combat. So even if we take Ukrainian assessment of up to 300,000 FPV drones manufactured monthly, a lot of them are going to suffer from poor quality. They're not going to fly out of the box right away. Some of them will fly just several kilometers and crash. There's massive amount of electronic warfare fratricide on both sides, with Ukrainian and Russian forces jamming everything that flies, including their own UAVs. There's lots and lots of countermeasures. And of course, the ability to fly drones for both sides is limited by the number of pilots. And so Russian civil society right now is stepping up in a completely unprecedented effort to train thousands of FPV and quadcopter pilots. This is done with private financing, sometimes with state and regional financing, but again, mostly on people's own dime. And so the large number of FPV drones manufactured comes down to a much smaller number actually fielded. But that number, which could be several thousand to several tens of thousands of drones used monthly, is enough to maintain this relative stalemate that we are seeing right now in the field. and movement and gains in territory are rather incremental. But we do have to acknowledge this unprecedented involvement by civil society, by lots of volunteers and startups, some of which have become relatively mature efforts, which have been sanctioned by the United States, as they are capable of mobilizing society and people across the country in many cities, and they're capable of delivering supplies. They're capable of assembling FPV drones, buying and purchasing quadcopters, motorcycles, vehicles, cars, assemble medical kits, nets, masking nets or clothing, and everything that the soldiers need. In fact, on Russian Telegram channels, there are daily pleas for a very specific set of equipment, which almost always includes medical supplies and Chinese-made quadcopters. All of that adds to the ability of the overall Russian defense industry to manufacture larger, more expensive systems, which are also fielded. And so what we have towards the end of the report is this recognition that a combination of commercial components, dual-use components, as well as military components are adding to strengthening the Russian military overall.
Let me turn to the shakeup at the Russian Defense Ministry. So Sergei Shoigu, after more than a decade, is now out. There's a new defense minister, Andrei Belousov, with a finance economic background. This has sort of been seen as essentially Russia now really focusing on defense industrial production, preparing for a long war. Other interpretations have highlighted that, well, maybe this is a shakeup, that things aren't going so well. Another interpretation as well, it's just the beginning of, we forget, it's sort of Putin just won an election, a quote unquote an election. This is the beginning of a new term, sort of a logical time, I guess, in that sense, to start with a new team. Dara, what do you make of the transition shakeup, whatever you want to call it, at the Russian Defense Ministry, and what do you think this portends for the future of the war effort?
Well, I learned a lot about their motivations from how they do things. Mm-hmm. And so it's important to give a brief little history here of Shoigu and Putin. They are very close friends. They are the kind of friends that they go and they have barbecues out in the middle of the taiga. Like they're very close. But Shoigu has a lot of enemies. And those enemies extend to the defense industrial base and powerful oligarchs that Putin also listens to, and even annoyance within the military blogger sphere. It's quite intense at times, and within the uniformed military itself. So I view how they moved him as a recognition by the Kremlin that, you know what, this isn't working out anymore, but he's my good friend and he's been very loyal to me. I can still use him. And so he was given a very good position. He's now replaced Patrushev. Belousov, initially I had flashbacks to Sergikov. He was the defense minister from 2008 to 2012 until he was deposed by the FSB for corruption. He was also an outsider from a financial background. He was brought in, along with Makarov, as chief of general staff, to initiate a comprehensive reform program to break a lot of China and break it quickly. And he was empowered to do this by the Kremlin. Complete top-to-bottom reorganization of the Russian military, starting a new procurement program, a lot of new training programs for the personnel. He made enemies quickly, but he also would fire people if they were not on board. So we're talking like 25% of the officer cadre just gone as part of force reductions. Once he got too close to the money, investigating the corruption schemes and things like that, and he was also involved in his own corruption schemes, that's when he ran into trouble. And there was this very dramatic, on Russian TV, his house getting raided and there were bags of money and, you know, this whole sordid business. So I initially thought of that about Belousov, but I don't think that's actually the right read. As Belousov, he is an outsider. He's an economist. He has an economic mind. He's not a bureaucrat that can, I think, understand everything that's going to happen underneath him within the general staff and some of his people who report to him. But he's not an outsider. He's been in Moscow for a long time. He is ideological. He comes from a family of ideologues. I understand why he was selected, because Putin wants efficiency. He wants saving rubles and this and that. But Belousov is inheriting a structure that is incredibly resistant to people looking into financial flows. So I don't think that he's going to do very well. He'll do well to a point, and then you'll see the general staff, as Sam pointed out, start to dig in their heels, because there are long-standing relationships between the people in the Ministry of Defense, General Staff, and Chemisov and Rostec. And if somebody comes in and starts yanking on those chains and investigating the money, that's when problems will happen. So this is going to be an interesting experiment. His personality type, I don't know him particularly well, but people who worked for him in the past, he's like a quirky economist. And I'm trying to figure out how that leadership style is going to make sense for the Ministry of Defense. We'll see what he does. Again, with the state armaments program, this is a long-range 10-year plan, and you have to have the money lined up for it. So that'll be the first thing. So we'll see how he does.
Sam, I want to bring you in. What do you think of Dara's comments, and has he said anything about what he's planning on doing, or is that we're sort of going to wait for the long-term Russian armaments program? Dara,
Yeah, this is a good segue to Sam. He's said that he wants to increase innovation, but there are powerful structural problems at the lowest level of innovation trying to get that civilian base plugged into Rostec, who doesn't want to give up market share because they have a 20-year gig going with Group X and they don't want to bring in new. So I hear what he's saying, and it's the right thing to say, but the structural nitty-gritty where these deals are made, I don't know.
Sam, over to you.
I completely agree with Dara. I will add that Belousov is not mired in corruption the way most levels of the Russian MOD were. So to the soldier to the ground, to that junior to mid-level commander who are blaming the military corruption on lack of weapons, lack of systems, lack of preparation, and just overall bad state of affairs, Belousov comes in almost on a white horse as someone who can actually salvage the situation. But again, as Dara pointed out, he is going to be dealing with an absolutely massive machinery that's resistant to change. Innovation presents itself as an opportunity for him. He is known to be speaking truth to power. One of his more famous video clips comes from a few years ago where he's talking to Putin and he's actually saying that Russian UAV sector, Russian drone development depends on imported components almost up to 95% or so. And President Putin acknowledges that and wants something to be done. So that was then, and this is now. The Ministry of Defense and the position of the defense minister is an extraordinarily high-profile position. All eyes will be on him, and he's got very little room to make mistakes. So as Dara also said, he will be careful in how he selects certain projects and how he applies himself. But yes, he will have to deal with Rostec's almost complete dominance of most of Ministry of Defense procurement and acquisition pipelines. He will have to deal with other massive enterprises which are doing their own thing for years and do not necessarily want to change. One of the more interesting elements from this war is how quickly Russian soldiers were capable of adapting some of the commercial technology provided by volunteers and startups on a very small scale, unevenly, with different units having different levels of success, but they are capable of adapting them, including not just unmanned aerial vehicles, but also unmanned ground vehicles development. And so this runs counter to massive programs to build out different types of intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and combat drones by the likes of Rostec and many other enterprises. So again, it's unclear what he's going to do. He knows all eyes are on him. He knows he's the center of attention, so he'll probably be careful in what kind of boats he chooses to rock.
Maria, maybe let me turn it over to you. You are a longtime reader of the tea leaves when it comes to the Russian elite. What do you make of the shakeup that we have just seen in the Russian Defense Ministry?
Well, I definitely agree with the comments of our participants, especially the fact that this shakeup certainly is an adjustment, an effort to fight corruption, which really is one of the original sins of the so-called Russian military. We understand that it is recognized by Putin as well as a problem, and I think I agree that Belousov is an interesting appointment. It looks fairly smart. It also looks like an adaptation, as Sam pointed out, and a preparation for a long term, right? This is the person who may not be extremely creative and innovative, but it's somebody who at least has the record of not being corrupt and delivering on the government orders, so to speak, at least the way I read this appointment. I also wanted to flag another interesting development within the Russian elites. I work a lot these days on the legacy of the Soviet nomenclatura in contemporary Russian elites. And one particular part that becomes very straightforward after the last wave of appointments is this family nature of these appointments, right? We see increasing number of the elite kids, so to speak, Kovalchuk, Patrushev, Tikhonova, who is allegedly Putin's daughter, increasingly playing more important roles. But more recently, with regards to the defense ministry specifically, Anna Tsivilova, who is allegedly Putin's niece, has been appointed deputy defense minister for actually a very high position. It remains to be seen how they will deliver. But to me, what it says is that, first of all, there is a deliberate effort to make the system reproducible beyond just Putin, right? We don't know who is going to be the next successor, and it's probably a while until somebody is going to really be considered for that role. Putin is not going anywhere. But there is an effort to make the system sustainable over the long term by replacing the old elite members with newcomers who are also loyal. And the loyalty is ensured by them belonging to the right network, to the right family, which means, to me, again, as an investment in the long-term future. And while we think of these people as not being ideological in the sense that they're not really devoted Marxists, I would say that these people are to an extent ideological, meaning that they probably believe the same statist ideas, anti-Western ideas that Putin embraces. And he makes point that to incorporate them into the system, so the system gets used to them and they get used to the system so that it's reproducible over the long term. The system is also becoming increasingly more closed off, as demonstrated as the emergence of the so-called new aristocracy. It will be probably quite hard for newcomers to break through, except unless you were lucky to be Putin's guard at some point, as Dumin's example has demonstrated. And in a lot of ways, it exhibits the patterns of the late Soviet Union. But so you would hope that it means that it will also follow in the footsteps of the Soviet Union and collapse. But one major difference is, as Sam pointed out, remarkable adaptability of the system that Soviet Union did not possess. It's now market economy, and we have seen that despite the vast, targeted number of sanctions that was aimed specifically at undermining the foundations of the system, unfortunately, the adaptation was quite successful. So we have essentially a new emergent but much more adaptable Soviet Union, which unfortunately I think will constitute a sustained long-term threat to the West.
I mean, nepotism doesn't seem like a great way to run a government, but Dara, maybe quickly, or Sam, just curious for your reaction to, Putin's alleged niece being appointed as deputy defense minister doesn't strike me as sort of, the best appointment. And also, I could see a lot of pushback within the Ministry of Defense and the bureaucracy and the defense industrial complex. I'm curious, what is your take on this? Is she sort of there to act as resident minder for any changes that might be happening or grumbling that might occur lower?
I'm trying to think of who would be so bold as to complain about Putin's niece.
Maybe that's the point.
And survive. He would have complained. 1 year ago. Rostov coup attempt. So her appointment to me in particular is interesting. Putin has looked out for her and her husband for decades. I think they were given ownership of a coal mine. It was pretty lucrative financially. He is the governor of Kuzbas. which is direct appointment. She had a psychology degree from the late 80s, early 90s, and she was appointed to run the Defenders of the Fatherland Fund, which is a new organization created since the start of the war that is allegedly to help Russian veterans get their benefits and reintegrate back into society. That's what it is nominally supposed to do. The efficacy of this organization, it wasn't particularly well funded to do that humongous task. They do have them set up in every region. She was in charge of it. But I am told that for the first couple months, this organization was run by clinicians and medical professionals, and they were trying to reach out to different groups within Russia and internationally to understand the challenge of PTSD and all of this. And then they put her in charge, and it changed tone pretty much immediately to a lot of sporting events for military families, which is important. I'm not downplaying that, but it became more of a show in some regions. Some regions it's effective, some regions it's not, based on the people who are working there. So for her to be elevated from that now into a deputy defense minister position, also nominally looking at social services, to me is an important signal. Because Russia, whether they want to admit it or not, they do have a very significant social problem coming home when these men are demobilized. And so this, to me, by putting the niece in the job, is a signal to everyone else, like, this is important. It's also jobs for family. Like, we all have to, like, this is nepotism. It is. But he could have put her in another job, and he chose this one. And so I think it's a signal that they're looking at how to reintegrate veterans or make sure they don't come home at all, and they put them in a mercenary pipeline in Africa or something. But I do think that it's a signal that I'd like to keep watching.
Sam, do you have any thoughts on that before we turn gears?
I agree with Dara. I think it was a very good assessment. I don't know enough about her, but one of the patterns we're all watching right now is the slow replacement of some of the older cadres with newer cadres. And so there's a new generation of bureaucrats coming in at the highest levels of power in the Kremlin, in the MOD, and in other ministries. And her appointment represents part of that trend. Apart from that, I guess it's a wait and see right now.
Well, let's turn to North Korea. We talked about it briefly to kick off the conversation. Putin just did a historic trip to Pyongyang, seemingly throwing out the window, half a century of Russian action on nuclear nonproliferation, and really sort of engaging with North Korea in a way that we haven't seen in a very long time. What does this say about the Russian war effort? Is Russia just sort of desperate to get more artillery? Is this sort of the user going to his dealer and just needing to get another re-up? How do you all sort of perceive of this visit, and what implications you take from it for Russia's war effort? Dara, maybe let me start with you and then go to Sam and Maria.
Yeah, quite an interesting trip. A lot of Stalinist, Uncle Stalin vibes from how they presented that. But on a serious level, Putin's poker face is much better than Shoigu's poker face was when he went over. Was it last year, I think, when he had to go and kind of pay some respects? His poker face was very poor. I didn't want to be there, but he did what he had to do to get the artillery when it was needed, and it was needed. And the dud rate is high, which is the failure rate. Anywhere I've heard 25%, 50% of North Korean artillery shells don't fire properly or fire at all. But it still came at a very critical point for them before mobilization had really increased that rate for them. I had the opportunity to help the Washington Post just today. The story came out about all the shipments that are still ongoing from North Korea into Russia. They're explosive cargo. That's all we know. They're marked explosive. One of the most dangerous categories, and they're shipping them across Russia to their ground depots. Ground depots are anywhere from artillery to rockets and missiles and everything. All across, they're dropping them off. So it's not just artillery. There's other components probably going in as well. Russia has very few partners. North Korea is one of them. Congratulations, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I think someone on Twitter showed Putin's posture when he was meeting with Lukashenko versus meeting in North Korea, and he was very forward-leaning, not slouched back. But Sam, what is your take on what this means for what this says about Russia's current ongoing military efforts? Are they, looking at potential shortages of artillery? There's been a lot of focus, obviously, in the U.S. and Europe on trying to ramp up artillery production to match Russia's. What takeaways do you have from this visit?
Well, North Korea is the ultimate survivor in the sanctions game, and it's been avoiding sanctions for many decades. It was able to maintain its military and even redevelop and upgrade some of its older systems into new fighting systems. And I think that experience is highly sought after by Russia. I believe last year, Russia and Iran had a special meeting for their business people, and Iran basically said that Russia doesn't have to relearn how to avoid sanctions, it can just use Iranian experience. I think the same could be said for North Korea. Russia can learn a lot about sanctions busting and how to use few available partners to actually get what it needs. After all, North Korea's survival is assured by China and a handful of other states. And so this experience is highly important for Russia, apart, of course, from the fact that most of North Korean military is actually legacy Soviet military systems. So the whole copy-paste principle of using North Korean shells in Russian systems very much applies.
Maria, what is your read, maybe from more of the foreign policy angle, on what does this mean essentially that Russia's first and only priority right now is just its war effort, and that has become sort of front and center and front of mind for everything that is sort of guiding how Russia engages globally?
The war effort, yes, but against whom? That's the question, right? We tend to focus on this dynamic between Russia and Ukraine for understandable reasons, but I think this effectively military alliance between Russia and North Korea, based on this document that they signed, right, immediate military assistance guarantees, that actually goes beyond just that. To me, Russia really is responding to the Western assistance to Ukraine by saying, hey, like, you're supporting like the country that's important to me, and I'm going to do the same. I'm going to create problems to the country that's important to you, which is South Korea. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why this particular trip has attracted a lot of Western attention and a lot of concern, because essentially we see this attempted effort to build this counterbalance, the Western support for Ukraine, by creating this alternative alliance of the rogue states, if you will, where it goes certainly beyond just munition supply. We know that also North Korea is sending short-range ballistic missiles, which have already been identified on the ground in Ukraine. There's labor assistance, because as we have discussed, labor is a big issue in Russia these days. So North Korean labor is being sent to Russia. And on top of that, there's also sanctions circumvention, but also energy purchases on North Korean side. The extent to which, this is going to be some major deal breaker, and I doubt, given that North Korea has probably quite limited resources, but it's clear that Putin is after some, long-term counterbalancing of the West, and he will not lose an opportunity to create as many trouble as possible.
Yeah, I'd encourage listeners or viewers, to look at some of what our colleague Victor Cha, who is one of the foremost experts on North Korea, has done a lot of work and analysis on this. And he sort of highlighted the potential for this to boomerang in a negative way for Russia, positive way for the U.S. and South Korea and Japan, and really cementing our relationship in that trilateral bond, as well as South Korea potentially doing more to support Ukraine, which is something that they have perhaps indicated.
And I'll just quickly jump in by saying that one of the ways in which this can backfire is China, because it's not clear whether China is pleased with this increased collaboration between Russia and North Korea. To what extent is China is kept in the loop? I guess we'll wait and see.
Great. So we have about half an hour left. We've done an hour on the Russian defense industry. I sort of want to turn a little bit to maybe the kind of level set on where we are in this war, and then what we perhaps see or are assessing from both the Ukrainian defense industry and our own defense industrial production as well as Europe is the pro-Ukrainian side matching some of what we're seeing on the Russian side. We've highlighted how Russia is gearing up and responding, but maybe we could look a little bit at ourselves and about Ukraine and how we see that Ukraine is responding. Maybe we'll start first on the Ukraine, and then I think the second half of the conversation we'll spend a few minutes there, and then we'll go and look at where do we think this war is headed and what are some of the challenges ahead. Dara, maybe I could start with you on how is Ukraine responding to this kind of current dynamic where Russia forces have been on the offensive, they're pummeling Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. Ukraine is ramping up or has defense industrial production. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that and how also you just sort of see the current state of where we are in the conflict right now, end of June. How has the Russian offensive worked out, and what does that kind of say about where this war will go?
Yeah, so
lots of questions.
Yeah,
there.
How do I summarize these very, very large questions? I'll start with the Ukrainian defense industrial base. They have their own advantages and disadvantages. I think where the Ukrainians excel is innovation and adaptation at lower levels, recognizing that there may be a problem with the center's ability to provide, and so you need to develop on-the-ground networks and on-the-ground solutions and move quickly on it and disseminate it. The Ukrainian system is much more tolerant of that, like recognizing that there is grassroots development, R&D going on, things being communicated between units. They don't necessarily force everything to go up in this vertical and then take time to matriculate down. So I think that's a big advantage. But like so many things in Ukraine, they are still inheriting a Soviet system of the defense industrial base and some regulations that are cumbersome and take a lot of time and are not efficient at all and are so much red tape to get through, from concept development to actual fielding in the hands of soldiers. So there is a bit of tension between the official defense industrial base and these civilian organizations and private defense industrial firms that are trying to create solutions, reach out to international partners and get deals signed, having to run it through. So I still see some of that, push and pull between the Soviet kind of past and wanting to have a Western outlook and Western approach. Very hard to do while you're in the middle of a war like this. And especially, and this is just a real challenge for them, the Russians, from the start of the war and continuously, have been more effective at targeting defense industrial sites than many other aspects of their strike campaign. So they've gone after large factories, they've gone down to medium level factories and those that supply them, and they hit them with missiles, to even like little individual workshops now. So it's just it's very dangerous. There is no sanctuary in Ukraine. If Russia detects a drone manufacturing organization and has the resources and the targeting lock on it, they have the ability to do it.
And you can't just move these things around.
They're trying to.
Yeah.
I mean, this is just incredible amount of work that is being federated, in basements or, other types of buildings, which then, you expose civilians to it if it's in the middle of a city. It's very complicated, but they are trying to do the best that they can. In terms of their disadvantages, Russia has a functional defense industrial base, and the Russians look out at what is working on the Ukrainian side and they say, I want that. And then they can bring it home faster and scale it up and then kind of flip it around. The biggest challenge that I see right now is the Russian ISR, their intelligence reconnaissance strike, loop, is getting really, really tight. And using drones and then having the ability to put like an SS-26 SRBM or an Iskander on it within minutes.
They're advanced missiles.
They're ballistic, so they're quick. They are targeting anything from helicopters that are fueling up. They're able to target ATACMS. They're targeting Patriot. I mean, these are high-value targets that they keep trying to go after and are succeeding increasingly.
So that targeting issue, which we saw at the beginning of the campaign, where it was like, the Russians can't, they may see a target, but they can't strike the target
Right.
as fast as we could, for instance.
Yes.
Now they've shrunk that and are becoming more
They've
capable.
shrunk it, and Sam is here as the expert on this. But the Zala and the Orlan, they're really important to that. Russia continuously adapts its EW cycle, and also I suspect, and others suspect, that they are somehow receiving commercial satellite imagery either provided to them from China, or they're getting it through shell companies from the West. The Ukrainians have noted this too, where a site will be imaged, and then a couple days later it's got a Russian missile on it. And so how have they created shell companies essentially to get that strategic ISR problem or operational depth fixed? They have.
But one of the things that we have seen is that Ukraine, using its own indigenous drone production capabilities, particularly when it comes to at sea, pushing back the Russian Black Sea Fleet, having real strategic effects. I was actually in Odessa, and the sea lanes were open. There were ships coming through, and also strikes on Russian territory using Ukrainian-owned developed technology. Sam, is the focus of Ukraine's defense industry? Is it drones? Is that where they're really putting their effort, because that's they're hoping to get their artillery and other systems from the West, but the strike, the deep strike inside of Russia, that's what they're going to do themselves. Is that how are they creating a division of labor?
It's definitely one of their major efforts, and we see how successful they've been with striking so many Russian energy and oil and related energy infrastructure installations. There are now several dozen types of designs of long-range aerial drones that can strike up to 1,500 kilometers inside Russia, which puts most of Russia's population, infrastructure, industry well within the reach of Ukrainian drones. There are also maritime drones, as you have indicated, which are also quite successful in going after the Russian fleet. But that's not the only concentration in the Ukrainian defense industry. They've been on the cutting edge of identifying and protecting their facilities against Russian drones and missiles. And so it's not just drones, but also electronic warfare, radio electronic reconnaissance, development of different types of kinetic systems to shoot down drones, systems which are redesigned both from older Cold War designs as well as some of the newer designs, as well as applying their high-tech know-how into developing command and control systems and information and data analysis systems and information sharing systems to enable all of these different military points to work together to identify targets and then to strike targets. And in many ways, Ukraine is actually ahead of the entire world in that, and it gives a run for its money to even more established militaries around the world.
So, Dara, maybe let's go back to that big, broad question that I asked a little bit ago. Where do you see the current state of the Russian offensive? Because I asked this because now we're, what is it, almost 2 months or roughly 2 months on from the U.S. passing its supplemental assistance. It was very clear that Ukraine was holding on by its fingernails, but now aid is, and correct me if I'm wrong here, aid is flowing. Doesn't seem like Russia's advances on the ground have resulted in much more than maybe a few tactical kilometers here and there. Yet Russia has been throwing a lot at Ukraine. Did Russia miss its moment? And then what does that say if the kind of current state of the war, if Putin has to go to North Korea to kind of get a re-up of supply? Has the war, have the winds of the war shifted a little bit more in Ukraine's direction because of U.S. assistance? And how do you see the current state and maybe the role of Western aid right now?
Yeah, so Ukraine has had two challenges in the spring that were urgent. One was it needed that supplemental, it needed weapons ASAP, and it has that now. They're flowing in. The other issue that hasn't been resolved is manpower and Ukrainian units. Mm-hmm. The Ukrainians are aware of this problem, but there's not a large enough mobilization push to fix this. They've changed the ages a little bit on the margin. They're also looking into recruiting prisoners. They're aware of it and they're trying to fix it, but again, they're not flipping it into a different gear and pushing anything towards a deeply unpopular general mobilization. They're not doing that. So I think we've passed the worst of it in terms of the weapons scarcity issue, and that is what is blunting Russia right now. Now they have created a pretty sizable salient that they're reinforcing in Donetsk, and it's very clear their best units and where they're putting most of their effort is Donetsk. So I think they want to keep pushing to a few critical roads, and they're not far from these critical roads. I mean, we're talking 20 kilometers. They're almost under fire control, and if they do that, Ukraine can't really reinforce. So this is serious in Donetsk. It's not yet there, but on this trend line, I think we have to think about Donetsk this year. If they are not able to stop that and push Russian forces back, that could look quite bad. But I think we also have to look at what happened in Kharkiv. So Russia created a new operational group of forces a few months ago, and then they pressed in, they tried to go in. That was a trained group, as in they were mobilized and they had been training in training fields for a few months. So they were trained, they had little to no combat experience. And so they get in there, and it just, initially they had success because there weren't that many Ukrainian units, or the TDF were overrun and too many glide bombs came. Long story short, that sector has been reinforced, and now it's stopped. To your question of, did Russia miss a moment? Well, it's been interesting to me to watch Gerasimov in particular squander the advantages that were given to him by his predecessor, Surovikin, with mobilization of the economy, with mobilization of the 300,000 troops. Gerasimov immediately committed them last winter to the winter offensive that failed, and then they kind of licked their wounds and rode out the Ukrainian counteroffensive, and then they went on the offensive again. And they've just been doing this for 5 months straight. I mean, this is what he's going to do. 5 attacks, it's his signature. So far, they're able to calibrate the losses of volunteers that they're getting. They're getting in a certain amount each month. They're losing a certain amount, whatever the real numbers are. 30,000 a month, I don't believe in. But in terms of the effects on the ground, they're calibrating tightly. But this is why you see them not being able to push forward, despite having all these advantages, despite having all the artillery advantages, despite having the glide bombs and everything else. They're inflicting cuts on Ukrainian forces, but they just don't. Right now, they are not using their forces wisely. I'm not going to tell them how to do it, but that's where they're at.
Sam, how do you see things right now playing out on the front, and maybe the role of Western aid and its importance?
I think it's important to acknowledge that Russia has the capacity to wait out Ukrainian military capabilities and the Western ability to aid. Russia can absorb casualties on a massive and staggering scale, and has done so in 2022, in 2023, and this year, and can probably do the same next year as well. Russia has the ability to reconstitute the units and use older equipment if necessary, as well as a combination of military and civilian equipment to accomplish its many tactical goals. It is capable of doing so simply because there's no real opposition to anything that's done at the highest levels of power, something that we have to acknowledge. If this was a war conducted by society in the West, everything would be different by now. But in Russia, things are done from the top, and there's no real resistance in any way, shape, and form to what the Russian government wants and what the Ministry of Defense is doing. And so Russia can continue doing the same, as Dara has pointed out, and actually continue to gain territory and even to exert certain pressure on the Ukrainian forces. Western aid is extremely important in this scenario. Ukraine has been able to hold back some of the Russian attacks and advances by using a greater amount of aerial drones, for example. But even using those successfully is no substitute for using artillery shells. And so once the Western aid arrives, it would give Ukraine much needed ability to not just push back against the Russians, but actually give them something to be stressed about at different parts of the front. We have to acknowledge once again that the Ukrainian front is very large, and forces are committed across the front at different levels, meaning there are different parts of the front which exhibit certain strengths and weaknesses on both sides. And so it is very important for Ukraine to get Western aid so it can continue exerting pressure and respond to Russian counterattacks and its ability to build up the forces, and to Russia's ability to actually absorb a lot of casualties and continue going.
I want to maybe now turn to kind of where we see this war headed. And Maria, maybe I'll start with you, but to sort of pick up on the point that Sam just mentioned about the kind of limited constraints on Putin's ability to conduct this war, the high tolerance for casualties. Is the kind of Russian support for this war kind of limitless in the sense of, we have incredible casualty numbers. As you mentioned, though, the economy is running hot. But, do you think there will be sort of a guns butter debate inside of Russia that will, or maybe not debate is not the right way, or guns butter angst that may develop over the kind of all the money pouring into the defense industry, but yet challenges on the social side? Curious how you see Russia, the kind of Russian public, the Russian elite, long-term support, particularly if there's no, Dara mentioned that they're on the cusp of some gains, but no sort of, structural strategic gains after another year of fighting if we enter 2025 in kind of a similar place.
Great question, and I'm afraid we are learning about Russian society as the one revels more. So we kind of our expectations and analytical forecasts tends to evolve as we see the responses of the Russian society to this war. Specifically, at the start of the war, many have expected that we will see some sort of an Afghanistan dynamic where this accumulation of losses of the casualties will eventually convert into some sort of social resistance on the ground. But despite the fact that Russian losses officially outnumber what the casualties in Afghanistan by tenfold or more even, right? We're talking about 15,000 total in Afghanistan, something like that. It still has not at all converted in anything remotely close, which suggests to me personally that the origin of the collapse of the system in the late Soviet Union was slightly quite misspecified by analysts at the time, and where the real origin of the problems came from the economic problems, the fatigue with the system, which then was triggered by this perception of the casualties in the war and eventual loss of faith in the system. Right now, we see something entirely different, where, as Dara and Sam have pointed out, the effective response of the Russian economic team to the war has actually resulted in quite unprecedented growth of the Russian economy for now, with the costs, and I'm coming to that in a little bit. And also, actually, the situation has improved dramatically, specifically for the regions which tend to be the losers in the Putin systems. We see right now that the poverty rate is fallen in Russia as the military industry opens up and recruits more people in the regions which traditionally tend to lag behind. Also, the recruitment was quite successfully adjusted after the original general mobilization, which was not so popular. The Kremlin readjusted towards targeting more worse-off regions with high unemployment, where people receive a lot of money, in some instances enough to purchase an apartment even, for being recruited to fight in Ukraine, to volunteering for fighting in Ukraine, or even for dying there. And there's this phenomenon of these widows of the Russian soldiers who actually tend to enjoy the life according to some social studies lately. So with this dynamic, given the overall low value of the human right and life in Russia, I would not expect social protests anytime soon. In fact, recent polling data suggests that there's actually more support for the war right now than it used to be several months ago. Again, reflective of the propaganda in general, positive vision of where things are going. But it also suggests that the real Achilles heel of the regime is in the economic in the economy. We have seen that major crises in Russian history, including the collapse of the Soviet Union, happened after the oil prices collapsed, and so did the Russian revenues. This is when we'll see all of this dynamic that we've been discussing today crumbling, including the lack of investment in the military industry, lack of support for the society, payments to society, and eventual losses on the battlefield, which will definitely convert in decrease of support for the war. But unfortunately, we're nowhere near there yet. And one clear policy takeaway from this is for us to try and do better in targeting Russia's oil revenues.
Yeah, no, I think the targeting Russian oil revenues critical. How, I think, is a big question, something that we'll hopefully be able to do some work on, because, on the one hand, you want lower global oil prices. Well, the United States is the largest energy producer. You probably need greater production elsewhere. On the other hand, if you're trying to take Russian oil off the market, it's 10% of the global market share, and you don't want to create an effect where you're taking 30% of Russian oil off the market, causes prices to go up, and Russia still gains from higher oil prices. So it's a tricky needle to thread. They've tried to do it with the oil price cap. I think some effects, but strategically not so much, and I think those effects have faded. But Dara, Sam, maybe to you on some of the tactical innovations that we should be looking out for over the next year. Are there developments such as AI or in the drone space, or is this going to be sort of back to basics with air power becoming a bigger player in the war? What are some of the things that you're looking out for in kind of this evolving battlefield or battle sea as well, and battle space in the air in this evolving landscape?
Well, I know the Russian side is looking at counter-UAS technology, and there's actually a lot of companies who are complaining that they can't get the attention of the Russian state. Like, hey, we want to develop something, we just need you to give us some seed money so that we can bring this to a higher stage and we can implement it. So this is a priority effort for the Russians and also for the Ukrainians as well. In terms of game-changing technology, everyone's looking for that silver bullet, what's going to solve it. There's not one. Mm-hmm. There's not. It's not that it's not solvable. It's just don't look to F-16s to solve the problem, or don't look to, long-range ATACMS strikes on whatever to solve the problem. It has to be a strategy. You have to define what does victory look like, and you have to marshal your resources and your actions in pursuit of that goal. So I would like pretty soon for some kind of decision to be clarified on that point, at least here for the role that we play in town. In terms of what to look forward, looking out in the battlefield, what can we expect moving forward through the end of this year and early into next? Russia is starting to emphasize recovery of vehicles on the battlefield. They're doing a much better job of it. Maybe that will change now that Ukraine has more artillery shells, but they are starting to realize that this is not an infinite resource that they have, that they can just keep throwing Soviet-level stuff and not have a plan in place to build out new equipment at the rate that they are losing it. Right now, your report highlights it's only 20% new build. It's maybe 75 to 80% of equipment in Ukraine right now is refurbished Soviet-era stuff. A major game changer to me would be, again, turning the corner into 2025, where they do commit to a permanent change and they start building new factories and they really make that permanent investment to reconstitute the force as quickly as possible, and pushing aside some of the stability concerns that they have about labor or distorting the economy. That to me would be a significant red flag. We're not there yet, but it's good to be vigilant.
Sam, over to you.
Well, the Russian military is on the record for three distinct priorities following its involvement in Ukraine. Number one, using artificial intelligence for data analysis and for understanding the battlefield situation. Number two, development of different types of UAVs and aerial drones. Whether that includes using technologies from the civilian startup community remains to be seen. And finally, developing counter-battery fires and electronic warfare and counter-UAV systems, as Dara has indicated. And these are the three priorities that are actually receiving a lot of attention. They're actually receiving funding, but again, remains to be seen how Russia's very large bureaucratic machine is going to implement that, especially with a relative reformer at the top of the entire command structure, and whether Belousov would be able to actually take control of the processes which are necessary to implement all of these technologies and initiatives into the larger military structure.
Let me ask maybe finally about us a little bit, and that whether we're sort of ramping up our production enough, and by us I mean the kind of in general supporters of Ukraine, U.S., Europe, other countries around the world. The EU is actually meeting the end of this week. They're going to discuss something called Eurobonds, borrowing money where the EU could potentially then use that money to put money down on contracts to try to ramp up certain production. They're unlikely to agree to that, but it strikes me that that's where we're still sort of falling short a bit on the kind of ramp up. On the U.S. side, the supplemental, my understanding, enables the 155 millimeter production critical for artillery. That's going to be ramping up. Are we just sort of always lagging behind a bit where Russia is, or are we lagging way far behind? Dara, how do you see this in terms of if we just project out that U.S. support and Western support for Ukraine will kind of continue as is?
We've ramped up a lot in terms of artillery rounds. So we went from being dramatically far behind to still trailing, but not equalizing, but getting closer to it. And I think that's important, not just for us, but from some of our allies in Europe as well. There are various German companies that have been particularly forward-leaning in this regard, like Rheinmetall. What does it give us? I think if the Russians would like nothing more than to convince us that the only way to fight this war and have it not be escalatory is an artillery duel, because they will win that. That is what they are good at doing, is making a lot of artillery. There's an entire style of war that the United States honed and improved and made pretty great, and we're not using a lot of those capabilities because it's viewed as too escalatory. So I would just caution everyone to not let the Russians channelize you into thinking an artillery duel is the way forward and the only way forward here. So to your larger question, though, I would say that there's a few areas that there should be a wake-up call, and 2 years ago, and it's still not. With respect to air defense systems, we have a global shortage of them. Patriot is a very good system. There are not enough Patriots. We are now talking about asking for interceptors from allies and partners to keep feeding defenses for Ukraine, and this is a huge problem. It's a problem because the United States isn't particularly well defended with air defense coverage. Neither is NATO. Neither are some of our partners in Asia. So in the Middle East. So this is it's a real shortcoming.
Yeah, and we need to sort of shrink or bring that cost curve down of how much it costs to produce these interceptors. Sam, maybe sort of final thoughts from you.
I think we should be listening to Ukrainians a lot more. I think Ukrainians know what they need, what they want. Ukrainians have been studying the Russian threat very directly, and they actually have a lot of very important lessons learned for NATO militaries and for the United States. And so actually absorbing a lot of that knowledge into our force structure, into our acquisition and development pipelines is going to be extremely important going forward.
Great. Well, I want to thank you all. We're going to have to leave it at that. We're at time. But I think it's been a fascinating conversation. Again, I want to highlight the paper. It's Back in Stock, The State of Russia's Defense Industry After 2 Years of the War. Credit to my co-authors, Maria Snegovaya, Tino Dolbaya, Nick Fenton, and of course, Sam Bendett. You can get it online at our website, csis.org. You can find everything that Dara is putting out at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Dara, thank you so much for joining us. Sam, thank you for joining us from Florida. And Maria, thank you as always. If you like this conversation, also please take out your phone and wherever you listen to your podcast, bring up that app and subscribe to Russian Roulette. That is our podcast where we focus on issues like this, so please subscribe. Also, you can check out our sister podcast, The Eurofile, where we look at a lot of the issues involving European Union and NATO. There's a big NATO summit coming up, and we'll be incredibly steamy and hot Washington in a few weeks. And so we'll be doing lots of coverage on The Eurofile and Russian Roulette for that. But thank you so much for tuning in. Thanks to my guests, and we'll see you next time.